Hey everyone. Before we begin on these stories, I want to give a huge shout out to Stories After Midnight. He's going to be featured in another one of my videos in the near future, but I wanted to feature him before then and give him some exposure. He has an incredible voice, and I think he's extremely underrated. He's under 1,000 subs and I'd love to help him out, so if you enjoy his narration, be sure to check out his channel. It'll be featured in the description and in a pinned comment. I'm also going to let him have some things to say at the end of this video, so be sure to listen all the way till the end. Without further ado, let's begin on the stories. And remember to always stay hungry. Number 1. I've been into urban exploration for years at this point. There's just something about going into abandoned places that gives me a certain feel. It's almost like time traveling in a way. I've had some weird or creepy things happen while exploring, but there's only been one time I was actually scared for my life. The story takes place years ago at this point, but the memories from it are still vivid in my mind. My boyfriend became aware of a location out in the country that was abandoned and well hidden when he was traveling for work. It was only about an hour away from where we lived, so we decided to check it out. Our original plan was only to go scope at it, and based on what we saw, we would decide if we wanted to go back again to actually explore it. The weekend came and we decided to head over to the location. It really was in the middle of nowhere, like my boyfriend had said. I'm not even sure how he was able to spot it, as it was pretty covered up by trees and bushes. We parked the car nearby in a secluded spot and headed onto the property. There were multiple abandoned buildings and homes on the property. They were all in pretty bad shape and had appeared to have been abandoned many years ago, but they still appeared to be stable enough to explore. We were having a nice time. There wasn't anything particularly exciting in the first few buildings we explored, but it was still cool seeing everything, like always. Once we made it through the first several buildings and took pictures, we had 2 more left to explore. There was still one larger building left and one smaller structure that looked more like a house. We ended up checking out the house first, as it was on the way to the larger building. The house was in slightly worse shape than the other buildings we had previously been in, but it was still structurally sound enough to at least walk through. We explored the main and upper floors first. Again, it didn't contain anything of particular interest. We headed down to the basement last so we could check it out before moving on to the last building. That's when everything changed for us. So far, every part of the property looked like it had been untouched for years, but it was obvious that people had recently been in the basement. The first thing I saw when I was shining my flashlight around was a large amount of partially burned candles. There was a large amount of what appeared to be dried blood on the floor, and I even began to smell it too. Shining my flashlight on the walls, I could see what looked to be satanic drawings and the number 666 written in multiple places. This all certainly gave me a bad feeling, and my boyfriend wanted to leave, but I assured him it probably was just a bunch of kids playing around. Regardless though, I felt like I had seen everything I needed to down there, and we got out of the house. Once outside, I started walking over to the last building. My boyfriend had told me that we should just go to the car and that checking out the last building was a bad idea. I was still convinced that he was overreacting to what was only the work of kids. I told him that I wasn't leaving until I looked through the last building. He said that I could go in there if I wanted to, but that he wasn't going in with me. This didn't bother me, and I told him I would be back in just a few minutes and started walking over. I entered into the building and it seemed a lot like the first 3. Not a lot inside. I walked around and took pictures. When I got closer to the far end of the basement, I began smelling something awful. When exploring old places like this, it's not unusual for many of them to smell pretty awful, but this was really bad. I found a staircase that led into the basement. As I went down the stairs, I realized the awful smell was getting stronger. When I was a few steps from the bottom, I got my flashlight back out as it was dark down there. I immediately froze as soon as I turned it on. I was immediately able to see what the cause of the smell was. There were discarded animal carcasses lying throughout the floor, along with severed heads of various animals. I had seen everything that I needed to and quickly headed back up the stairs to get out of that place. I headed straight for the door I had entered through and made my way outside. I knew as soon as I saw those animals that it wasn't just a bunch of edgy teenagers that had been hanging out there. There must have been some type of actual devil worshipping going on, with the sacrifice of animals included. Once I was outside, I began looking for my boyfriend, but I didn't see him anywhere. I called out his name a couple of times, but realized he must have already headed back to our car. I thought that was a bit rude. If he was actually scared something bad was inside that last building, why wouldn't he have at least waited for me to make sure I didn't need help at some point? It just didn't make sense. I brushed it off and began walking to the car. I came over the top of a small hill and started heading down through the trees and bushes when I saw them. There was a group of people standing around the spot our car was parked at. There was probably about 8 of them total, ranging from teenagers to men in the 20s. I quickly realized that one of the men was actually inside our car going through our belongings. Almost like a reflex, I immediately yelled out to the men asking them what the hell they're doing. I seemed to have startled them and they all looked over at me as I continued walking towards them. At that moment, I realized my boyfriend was nowhere to be found. I also saw that some of the men were carrying baseball bats and just overall looked like trouble. I realized I was in a pretty bad situation and started to regret how I handled myself. The man who was looking through my car got out and asked me who I was and what I was doing here. I told him my boyfriend and I were just exploring the abandoned property as it was a hobby of ours. I then asked him why he was in my car. He replied by saying he was only trying to find out whose car it was, although I wasn't convinced that was the real reason. The man was being pretty aggressive and seemed to be trying to intimidate me, and it was working. I became very worried that my boyfriend had already had something bad happen to him, and that I was next. Just then, I heard someone coming from behind me. I turned around and was relieved to see my boyfriend. I asked him where he had gone and he told me he was checking out the property while he waited for me. At that moment, he noticed the men around our car. The man who had been looking through it was still standing next to the driver's side door, with it still being wide open. Despite being outnumbered and not having any weapons on us, my boyfriend became enraged. He began stomping towards the group, yelling at them and asking them what the hell they're doing. I feared he was going to cause something bad to happen to him, but surprisingly, despite having us so outnumbered, the men immediately ran off. As it turns out, they actually weren't looking for any trouble. We got in our car and quickly drove off. I have no idea what those men were up to. Nothing appeared to be missing from our car. I don't know why they were on the property, why they had weapons, or if they were responsible for the things that we found in the basements of the property. I still go urban exploring to this day, but ever since running into all of the disturbing things we saw that day, I always bring a knife with me. Number 2. I'm currently in college and have been into urban exploration since my early teen years. Before I was old enough to drive, I would just look for places in a walkable distance that I could explore. It was a lot of fun, but my options were pretty limited. I would visit and revisit a lot of the same locations. Once I had a license and got my first car, it was game on. I would get online and map out locations to visit, sometimes planning to hit several in the same area on the same night. I had a couple of childhood friends that would normally go with me, and we spent a lot of our weekend nights doing this in high school. Once we all graduated high school, though, we all went our separate ways. I started college but continued to explore in my free time. I was back to usually exploring by myself, but eventually started making friends and introduced them to the hobby as well. Most of the people I brought with me for the first time really enjoyed it and said they would like to do it again in the future. Eventually, I formed a small group that would go out and explore on many of our weekends. The main group only consisted of 3 of us, but we were pretty consistent. There was one building in particular that we loved to explore. We usually didn't go back to the same locations once we explored them, but this place was different. There really wasn't any kind of mystery left to it, but it was 10 stories high, and once you made it to the roof, you could see the entire city. It was beautiful and worth going back for. I was talking to a friend of mine about Urbex, and particularly that one building. He had never been exploring before and told me he really wanted to go check it out. So we ended up picking a day to go do it. My other 2 friends from my normal group came with us as well. When we all arrived, the 2 friends that I had brought that normally go with me decided they were going to wait outside, as they had already been through the building multiple times and didn't feel like going up all the stairs. So my friend who was brand new to Urbex and I headed in alone. We walked around to the one part of the building that had access to the inside of it. Just as we were heading in, 2 different individuals were exiting the building. This wasn't weird, as a lot of people came to check it out, and it was a well-known spot. I asked them if there was a lot of people inside, and they said that they believed there was only one other guy in there. They believed he was either on the top floor or the roof. They said we might want to avoid that area because the man sounded like he was pretty angry and was doing some yelling while he banged things around. I thanked them for the heads up and we headed in. I wasn't very worried about this man, as the place was huge and I doubted we would run into him. I showed my friend around the inside of the building a bit as we headed upwards. For the most part, the building itself wasn't very interesting. It was just abandoned and huge. Most people that came into that building did so in order to drink or spray paint, but the view itself was still worth the hike up the stairs. Once we were nearing the top floor, I still hadn't heard the man that people had told us about. I figured he had already left and I forgot all about him. We got to the top floor and proceeded to climb the ladder to get us onto the roof. Once we were up there, we took the time to rest and just admire the view. My friend definitely seemed satisfied, and his expectations of it were met. Our peace was interrupted by my cell phone ringing. It ended up being one of my friends that had waited outside. Apparently in the same area as the entrance to the building, there was a minor car accident. Therefore, the police were now there. They suggested we wait a bit before coming back down so we wouldn't end up getting in trouble for trespassing. I thanked my friend and he told me he would let us know once it was clear. We headed down to the 10th floor and were just looking around at things when we heard someone screaming. It didn't really alarm us at first, we just felt confused. A few minutes later, my friend from outside of the building called me again to inform me that the police were now gone and the coast was clear. We started heading down the stairs and occasionally heard the man yelling again. I couldn't tell where the yelling was coming from at first, but once we made it down to the 8th floor, it became clear. We were able to tell that the man was on the floor below us. He was still screaming and we heard a lot of loud banging noises at this point. It sounded like the man was deranged and obviously walking around slamming parts of the building with something large. I didn't know what the man had in his hands, but I could tell from the noise alone that it was something dangerous. I told my friend that the best plan would be to quietly go down the stairs and just get the hell out of there. There were several elevators in the building, but none of them worked, so we only had the one staircase to get us back to the ground floor. As quietly as possible, we started heading down the stairs again. The screaming and banging noises from the deranged man were getting closer and closer with every step. Once we made it to the 7th floor, we had to pass by the doorway of the floor to continue down the stairs. Still attempting to be quiet, we began walking past the door. As soon as I was passing it, I looked over into the 7th floor. I almost froze in place when I made direct eye contact with the man that was going crazy. He stood there staring at me for a few moments and then out of nowhere began charging at us, with his weapon still in hand. I told my friend to run and we began descending the stairs as fast as possible. The man was doing a good job staying caught up with us and was only about 1 story behind us. The 4th floor of the stairwell was pretty damaged, and it took a while to get through and continue down the stairs. I knew that the man would catch up to us before we could get through it, so when we got to that floor, I grabbed my friend and pulled him into the doorway. We ran and hid behind a pillar. We tried to be quiet and not to breathe too loudly. I was absolutely terrified at this point and thought the man had heard where we went. The man had now made it to our floor. He stopped in the doorway and just stood there. My friend and I didn't move at all. We just stared at each other, both with a look of fear on our face. There was nowhere else to run. The only exit this place had was going through that doorway and continuing downstairs. The man stood in the doorway for probably 10 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Thankfully, he didn't come onto the floor and instead continued heading downstairs. His screaming started up again and lasted for about another 10 minutes. Eventually it became quiet and we couldn't hear anything else in the building. I started whispering to my friend that we would wait a little bit longer and get the hell out of there as quickly as possible. After another 5 minutes or so, we decided we would go. The darkness of the inside of the building appeared to be enough cover and saved us. As soon as we stood up from our crouched position to head to the door, we heard another noise. It was coming from the same room we were in. We looked over and saw someone walking out of the shadows of the room towards us. We didn't stick around to see who it was and we both started running away. We climbed through the broken up area in the hallway and ran down the rest of the stairs. We made it outside where our other two friends were waiting for us. They asked us what took us so long, but I just told them that we needed to get to the car right away. We didn't waste any time and within a minute we were driving away. To this day, I don't know who that man was or what his actual intentions were. I also don't know who the other person was that was in the room with us when we were hiding. They were probably just another explorer also hiding from the man. But at the time, I wasn't interested in finding out. I didn't let this experience ruin urban exploring for me, and I still go do it quite often. I've also been back to that same building since this happened, but anytime I go exploring anywhere, I always make sure there's at least 3 of us.
Before we begin, I want to say that I'm Stories After Midnight, and I'm pleased to meet you. I want to thank Cannibal for featuring me in this video, so let's begin. Number 3. I am a female and in my late teens. I live in a very small town. There really isn't a whole lot to do around here. So, one day, I walked around my town bored out of my mind. That's when I came across an abandoned building. It used to be some sort of factory, but hadn't been used in years. I decided to try to get inside so I could look around, and that's exactly what I did. I walked around the outside of the building and eventually found a way in. There was a window pretty close to the ground that I was able to partially get open. I'm a rather petite girl, so I was able to slide myself through the window and into the building. I explored the building for a while and just admired the experience. Something about seeing everything left behind just gave me this certain feeling. It's like one day someone picked up one of these items, set it down, and never touched it again. It's difficult to explain, but at that moment, I knew I had definitely found myself a new hobby. There were quite a few abandoned locations in my area that were in walking distance, so I began exploring each of them. Everything was going fine, and I always had such an awesome experience doing this. But one day, I stumbled across something that kind of freaked me out. While exploring an abandoned building, I stumbled across someone's belongings in one of the rooms. There was some type of makeshift bed, empty water bottles, and food wrappers. By the way everything looked, I could tell someone had been there very recently. Almost everything inside the building was covered in dust, but the items in that room were not. I became extremely nervous that someone was in there with me, possibly someone that would think I invaded their space and might even try to harm me. Luckily, on that particular exploration, I never ran into anyone and got out of the building safely. From that point on, I decided that I was no longer exploring alone. I always made sure I brought a friend with me. This brings us to the most recent Urbex that I went on. I talked one of my friends into going to an abandoned location I've never been to before. She was hesitant at first, but eventually agreed. Once I told her how fun it was, and that I've done it a dozen times without any problems. We met one night and headed over. At first she seemed pretty excited, just like me. But once we actually got to the location, she became hesitant all over again. After looking around for a few minutes, I found us a way inside. We made it through the door in the back, which appeared to be the only way in, or out. As soon as we were inside, my friend basically froze up. She stayed right next to the door and wouldn't go any further. I tried to get her to come with me, but it just wasn't happening. With or without her, we made it inside, and I wasn't leaving until I checked the place out. It was a decently sized building with a lot of different rooms to go through. After about 10 minutes of exploring, I noticed a smell. It was almost a smell of body odor, but mixed with old trash that had been sitting around. Needless to say, I wasn't enjoying it much. I hurried to the next room to try to get away from it, but the next room smelled just as bad. This went on for quite some time, and eventually I just got used to it. A lot of time had passed, and I felt like I was satisfied with looking through the building. So I decided to head back to where my friend was waiting for me so we could leave. I was a little bit turned around by this point, but felt confident I could find my way. That's when I noticed that smell again, except this time it was stronger than before. I didn't think much of it and started walking, and for the first time, I noticed the sound of other footsteps that weren't mine. I didn't turn around, but I knew someone was there. The smell increased even more, and I could hear someone breathing behind me. I began walking faster, trying to find the quickest way out. As I picked up the pace, I heard the footsteps grow louder and faster as well. I kept going. I knew I had to get out of there. It felt like an eternity, but at last I was in the hallway that led to the door. I could see my friend still standing there waiting for me. At first, she threw her hands up to show how annoyed she was with how long I took. But once I yelled at her run, she quickly changed her attitude. She began getting the door open but appeared to have trouble with it. I was sprinting at this point, and as I neared the door, she finally got it part of the way open and slid out. I immediately tried the same thing and was forcing myself through the narrow door opening. Just as I was almost out, I felt a hand grab my ankle. This caused me to trip and fall down. The person that had my ankle squeezed it so tight that I yelled out in pain. They were pulling hard on it, trying to force me back inside. I tried kicking away, but they were too strong. Just then, my friend grabbed my hands and began trying to pull me away from whoever had me. At the same time, I continued kicking as hard as I could. Finally, I got my ankle free. The two of us began sprinting, not even looking back, although I don't believe we were followed once we were outside. We ran almost the entire way home, occasionally walking to catch our breath. Once we made it to my house, we finally had the chance to really talk. My friend tried rationalizing the situation, saying it was probably just a teenage boy trying to pull a prank. But I knew that wasn't the case. This individual smelled horrible, like they hadn't showered in weeks. Also, the way they pulled on my ankle was far more than a prank. We didn't talk too much after that incident. I ended up with some serious bruising on my ankle that took almost 2 weeks to go away. I absolutely love urban exploration, but this might have been the last time I'll ever go out and do it. Number 4. I got into urban exploration when I was a junior in high school. Around that time, you end up with more freedom and the ability to drive. My friends and I weren't at a shortage of fun things to do in our town, but the idea of going to places that were left and forgotten just sounded fun to us. We decided to go out one night and check out a local library that had been closed down for years. A newer library was built just down the block when the other one was abandoned. Apparently, it was cheaper and more practical for an entire new building to be built, rather than renovating the old one. They let the old one sit for years. It was never torn down and nothing else was done with it. My friends and I thought it would be the perfect place to go explore. More than likely, there were still going to be a lot of random things left behind from all those years ago. It was a total of 4 of us. I'm a male myself, and I was with another male friend of mine and our 2 girlfriends. We had all explored before in the past, but we had different levels of experience. I was one of the more experienced individuals in our group. We made it to the destination and parked down the street. When we got close to the library, we stayed in the shadows up against the building as we looked for a way in. It turned out that the library was locked and sealed up a lot better than most other abandoned properties, so we struggled a bit and almost gave up. We circled around the building again to give it one more shot, and that's when we noticed that there was an area we could drop down into. There was a grate covering up 2 walls. This originally was a ramp that went downwards to the basement of the library, but had since been covered up. The grate had a small gap in one part of it that was wide enough for us to drop down one at a time. We figured it made the most sense to lower the girls in first before we climbed in ourselves. They agreed to this, and we carefully helped the first one down. She landed onto the ground just fine, but then she completely froze. We asked her what was wrong, and she said, "There's someone else down here. I can see the silhouette." We didn't know if she was just messing with us at first, and then she called out and said hello to the individual. Right after, we heard a man say hello back in a very disturbing way. He asked her what she was doing down there, and she replied saying, "Actually, we were just getting ready to leave." I could tell she was very uncomfortable and wanted to get out of there, and I didn't blame her. Just then the man replied saying, "Well, that's perfect, because I love chasing girls as they try to get away from me." He then started laughing in such a deranged way that his laugh put more fear into me than what he actually said. My friend and I immediately pulled her out of the hole, and the 4 of us began running. We didn't stop until we made it to the car and promptly took off. I have no idea who that man was or what he was actually capable of. I'm just glad we didn't find a different way in that would have had us stuck in there with him for any longer than just a few seconds.
Number 5. The story took place about 10 years ago when I was a teenager. My friends and I had heard about an abandoned mental hospital just outside of our town for years. People would always share ghost stories about the patients haunting the building. Apparently, there were a lot of various forms of abuse that went on there before it was finally shut down. We didn't believe in ghosts, but once we got into our teenage years, the idea of exploring the place became very intriguing. We eventually decided to go through with it and had made a decision to ride our bikes there on a Saturday. For whatever reason, we always knew that there was an old man that oversaw the property, although it wasn't his. He had just kind of claimed it a few years back, as no one else ever did anything with it. None of us knew what he did with the property, but we were pretty familiar with what this man looked like, as we would occasionally see him around town. He was a very strange man that none of us had ever actually talked to. Once we made it there, we all hid our bikes in the bushes and proceeded to walk towards the property. One of our friends who didn't want to go into the hospital said he would stay behind to watch our bikes and would text us if the old man or the police were nearby. We all agreed to this, and the other 3 of us headed towards the hospital. We made it there and searched for an entrance. Eventually, we had to break a board that was covering what used to be a window, and we were able to get inside. We began walking down a corridor when already my cell phone chimed. It was a text message from my friend saying that the old man had discovered him and our bikes, and that the man was calling the police. Despite just getting there, we knew we had to leave. We all tried getting to the exit as quickly as possible. It was dark and we were moving quickly. That's when I tripped over something and fell down. One of my friends who had the flashlight on his cell phone lit up, turned around to see if I was okay. It was at that point that the area I was in became lit up. My friend started screaming before I even knew what was going on. I looked down and saw that I had tripped over the remains of a dead body. The body looked like it had been there for ages, but I'm not really sure. We started moving even faster at this point. Originally, we talked about hiding out in the woods, but after this discovery, we only cared about getting to our bikes and getting the hell out of there as fast as possible. It didn't matter if we ran into the police or not. We were no longer concerned about getting into trouble. We just wanted to get out. We sprinted back down the hill to our bikes, and just as we were about there, we were stopped dead in our tracks. The old man was standing there with a shotgun and he had it aimed right at us. He told us that we needed to leave and we were never to come back. We had no issue with this, but one of my friends asked what happened to the friend of ours that was waiting by the bikes. The old man kind of just chuckled and told us that he took off, leaving us behind. We started moving towards the bikes, and as we were pulling them out of the bushes, the old man spoke again. He said,
"By the way, if any of you ever mention what you saw while you were here, I'll come after all of you."
I guess he could tell by the looks on our faces that we discovered something pretty awful. We got on our bikes and pedaled away as quickly as our legs would take us. All the way down the long country road, we were never passed by a police car. And based on what we found, I'm guessing the man never called the police. We were too scared to report what we saw that day, which is something I still regret. Years after this happened, I ended up seeing the old man at a store one day. He was just staring at me with a sinister look before giving me a slight smile and winking at me. It's been a little over a decade now since all of this happened, but it still registers as the most terrifying experience of my life. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I hope you enjoyed today's video. Once again, I want to give a huge and special shout out to Stories After Midnight for helping me out on this video. Like I said earlier, I just found this guy a couple of days ago, and I love this guy's voice. He has got a voice of gold, so please be sure to head over to his channel, subscribe, and watch his videos. So again, Stories After Midnight, you're awesome, and thanks again for helping out. And as always, if any of you have a personal scary story you'd like to share with me, send it to my email at southerncannibal@gmail.com. And before we close this video out, I'd like to give a special thank you and shout out to all of my $5 or more patrons, as well as my $3 patrons that are all also featured on screen. So shout out to Ulisa, Babe Lincoln, Beth A, Kate E, Carrie B, Celeste S, Courtney T, Ellie S, Howard R, Jacqueline W, Jazzy G, Jennifer M, Jess, Jonathan C, Catherine M, Carrie F, Matthew B, Michael G, Random Randy, Steph L, Tammy S, and Terry H. Thank all of you so much for the support and being a patron. I really appreciate it more than you know. And if any of you watching would like to join these awesome people and also become a patron, head over to my Patreon at patreon.com/southerncannibal. Have a good night, everyone. And remember to always